I think we can start now. Good evening, everybody. And this is great pleasure for me to welcome you to our first online event. This is Mehmet Karakas, Director of London Yunus Emre Institute. This is part of our Art and Culture Lecture Series. Tonight, Dr. Omar Salha and Dr. Carla Figueira will explore humanitarian diplomacy, soft power, and the COVID-19. I will just briefly talk about Yunus Emre Institute, if some of you are not aware of it. Yunus Emre Institute is Turkey's only worldwide cultural institute operating in 48 countries with 58 centers at the moment. Through our cultural relations, our main objectives are to increase awareness of Turkish culture, to support the learning of Turkish language, and to stimulate greater exchange in the fields of arts, culture, science, and education. And today is one of the occasions where we brought two distinguished academics to discuss the current COVID situation from a different angle, to see how nations are adopting the new normal by using a variety of soft power options, such as the humanitarian diplomacy. Now, I would like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Carla Figueira from Goldsmith University of London. She is the Director of MA in Cultural Policy, Relations and Diplomacy, and she is also Director of MA in Tourism and Cultural Policy. She holds her PhD in Cultural Policy and Management from City University, and she is a lecturer in International Cultural Relations and Cultural and Linguistic Policies. And now I would like to leave mic to her to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Omar Salha, and set the scene for today's discussions. And thank you very much for participating in this online event tonight.
Hello, thank you very much. Thank you to all those that are attending tonight's talk. And of course, we have the pleasure of having Dr. Omar Salha talking to us about humanitarian diplomacy, soft power, and COVID-19. And I will be moderating the session. That means that while Dr. Omar speaks, we will have the chat open, and whomever is attending can ask questions. I will collect the questions, and after Dr. Omar talks, I will then pose the questions to him. But before we proceed, please let me introduce you to Dr. Omar Salha. So Dr. Omar Salha is Nohoud Scholar at the Center for Islamic Studies, SOAS, University of London, where he's been researching British football and Muslim identity. There at SOAS is also Research and Teaching Fellow at the Center for International Studies and Diplomacy, and is also a faculty member of the Islamophobia Research and Documentation Project at the University of California, Berkeley. And last but absolutely not least, he is the founder and CEO of Ramadan Tent Project. And I'm sure we will learn a little bit more about this project later on and all the activities that are going to be set up in the next few weeks. So with you, I will leave Dr. Omar, and he will share with us his reflections on humanitarian diplomacy, soft power, and COVID-19. And after that, we will open up for discussion, first with a few questions of my own, and then I will gather all the questions from the participants in the webinar. So thank you very much. Dr. Omar.
Dr. Carla, thank you very much. And Dr. Mehmet, thank you for having me as well. My many thanks to the Yunus Emre Institute. I understand this is the first of its kind, so I'm sure it will be no pressure to being here. And of course, this is the virtual world, which we're all becoming much more familiar with. So it's a learning process for everyone here. And as educators and academics, all of us included, I'm sure we all appreciate that as well, with ourselves and of course our students. So Tonight, really, I just wanted to focus on the three key, obviously, components that we mentioned in the title here. And I want to focus more about the foundation of what soft power is and how that manifests itself through humanitarian diplomacy. And of course, we'll touch a little bit around COVID-19 and how nation states have reacted to the global pandemic, and whether nations could have maybe adopted a different policy in response to the pandemic that we see today. I should mention from the beginning that this is by no means for us to explore the politics of coronavirus and COVID-19 and sort of the policy implications on certain governments doing that. That is part of diplomacy, and we'll touch on that as well. Could be a particular moment for nation states to exercise their soft power in such moments, and for others actually to almost call it out for propaganda. So that's also the two different sides of the same coin that we often look at. So I'd like to begin with soft power. And soft power, for those who are familiar in international relations and diplomacy area, was a term coined by Joseph Nye, an American academic. In the early 90s, he wrote a book, and he included the first time in his academic work the term soft power. And effectively, what that is the ability to exercise influence through non-coercive means. To change a particular perception, to change a particular way of thinking of the other to yourself, as in the nation, throughout exercising any direct force. And so our understanding of coercive and non-coercive, how do we define that? The thin line between the two is some academics will argue that coercive means involve military action. And as well, it will include in that is any financial transaction. So any financial transaction being made, which means that a country is effectively bribing another to change its perception. That is a form of hard power. Whereas when we look at non-coercive means, effectively the biggest policy push here in this area is soft power. And that is underpinned by several different pillars, if you can say. And they include culture, tourism, language, business culture in particular, trade, tourism for people coming in, visa travel. When we speak of culture, again, that's within that you look at media, you look at sport, food, technology, all embedded within that. And I suppose the important thing here is looking at how different countries exercise soft power in particular ways and particular strengths. So there are weightings to each of these variables. If we're familiar with the Nation Brand Index, which is done by several firms every year, they actually put a ranking of different nations in terms of their soft power. And how they measure that. Again, each variable has a weighting. And of course, we look at response from experts, response from those who are in that field, and of course, response from the general public of the nation, which is important. But actually, we should not begin with Joseph Nye. We actually should go a little bit further back and look at a French philosopher called Pierre Bourdieu. You'll have to excuse me, I have hay fever, so if I do take these breaks, I'm suffering from a seasonal hay fever, unfortunately. So, as I said, we move a little bit back beyond Joseph Nye. We look at Pierre Bourdieu. And why Pierre Bourdieu? Because he wrote extensively on social capital, on symbolic power. And effectively, symbolic power for Pierre Bourdieu was looking at individuals as private citizens. We all have the capacity to increase our social capital. And when we are in a position to, or a heightened position where we have that capital, we are then able to then enforce that recognition that we have onto others. And that is primarily done through symbolic power, i.e. Whether it is through a symbolic memory that we have Jesse Owens, for example, in the Olympics, I believe it was the 1936 Olympics, where he won, and following suit to that, there was the sort of Black Power salute. That act of symbolism really is quite emotive, and that in itself is able to then impose that recognition onto others. And so those early works of Pierre Bourdieu are what lay the foundation of what we come to understand as sort of modern day soft power. And of course, the fact that a term was coined in the early 90s does not necessarily mean that soft power existed from the early 90s. On the contrary, what traits of soft power have existed for centuries under empires, which we'll come to talk about as well. And I think it's important when we come to look at our understanding of soft power in that sense. There is the nation state, and of course there are non-state actors who are now involved in this arena. And so non-governmental organizations, charities would consider to be actors who are able to use soft power to spread its message, its mission, to highlight that across the world. And more so, we come to understand the understanding of course, technology and the virtual reality. Our understanding of traditional state-centered diplomacy is no longer the norm. Actually, what is becoming the norm is almost every ambassador and diplomat has a Twitter account which they're able to speak in the host language's language and reach out to them. So effectively, the extension of the state is now also represented in the country, not only in the form of a consulate and an embassy, a physical presence, but actually their interaction virtually as well, which is quite interesting. And so some will refer to this as digital diplomacy. So one may ask the question, well, what is the difference between soft power and public diplomacy? So if we can look at soft power as effectively the theory of persuading the other, i.e. the other actor, through non-coercive means, then how we go about doing that is effectively the practice of soft power. So we look at, for instance, public diplomacy. And the practice of public diplomacy is state A speaking to state B's foreign nationals. And that is a direct form of public diplomacy. Elsewhere, we may have come across cultural diplomacy. We may have come across sport diplomacy, where a country will host a sporting mega event, inviting millions of fans around the world to tune in or to visit. And that is a form of soft power as a sort of theory, but is practiced through sport diplomacy as the technique. So if we could think of a three-tier level, we begin at soft power, and then public diplomacy is the action, the practice of that soft power. And then the technique we decide to use is sport, media, culture, or food. And so that is where we come to now touch on humanitarian diplomacy is, again, precisely this. We look at the role in which we look at soft power, public diplomacy, and humanitarian diplomacy, and humanitarianism as a sector, and humanitarian aid and relief work actually fits in within the policy of a nation to exercise its soft power. So it is a strategic policy objective that to strengthen the nation's soft power, we must act on humanitarian diplomacy. So again, the relations between two or more states through humanitarian work, whether it's the recipient being a state itself or whether it's actually non-state actors. And this is where we see a traditional case study, which is quite befitting to Yunus Emre Institute here. If we look at the Ottoman Empire, during the Irish famine, the Ottoman Empire actually sent ships of aid to Ireland as a gesture, as a form of humanitarian diplomacy. And what ensued afterwards was quite interesting. So these ships were sent to a city called Drogheda in Ireland. And to this day, the local football club in Drogheda have actually adopted the crescent and the star, which were a symbol of the Ottoman Empire. And so to this day, you can search this after the talk, or whilst we're on here actually, the emblem of the local football club, Joghida Football Club, is actually the Ottoman crescent and star, which is quite interesting. And again, this is why we're able to connect now Pierre's early works on symbolic power, that the power of symbolism and the story and the notion of that. Of course, we can go further to look at Foucault as well, and the power of language, how all of that is really part of effectively what was soft power for the Ottoman Empire. Whether, again, what it was a strategic move to have the crescent and the star on the local football club is a discussion for another day, but certainly that act was an opportunity to show the Irish population that we are here in support of you and in solidarity with you. And what they picked up afterwards was quite interesting, that to this day, we still have that historic moment interpreted through a football team. And elsewhere, now, of course, you look at international aid on a whole. Differed, for example, here in the UK, talk of whether that should be part now of the FCO, and they should merge together, which is very interesting as well, to look at actually maybe this is a strategic power play and move to look at how Britain post-Brexit, in terms of its foreign relations, looking at humanitarian diplomacy as almost a form of soft power for the UK, which is quite interesting there. So, and again, of course, the amount of aid that the UK does and give across the UK, like the US, for instance, ranks at top 3 in the world in terms of foreign aid. So these are very, very interesting to look at, positioning the state in a much more favorable image, in a much more forthcoming, charitable way, that is actually extending its humanitarian arm to the world. And I think recently, we saw ships and cargo planes, rather, sorry, from the Republic of Turkey being sent to the UK, which was very, very interesting. So, of course, we hear news here that we are in a shortage of PPE equipment, and again, very, very interestingly, the Turkish government sending thousands of PPE equipment here, which was reported on the news and on social media, received a lot of positive response, and so not only from the public but online, but also from the government. And I think that is a continuation of what diplomacy effectively is. And if we had to boil down diplomacy into 4 key words, it would be communication, negotiation, presentation, and representation. And I think those are key elements in which any form of transaction, any form of relationship taking place here strengthens those ties between 2 or more states. So, and again, I quite like that example of the soft power touch, which was included within that, which was actually, not only was it a form of humanitarian diplomacy, which was very specific PPE equipment coming from Turkey to the UK, but also what I found very interesting was that there was also a quote, I believe, or a short poem from Rumi, which was also included and plastered on these PPE equipments, which we had sent over. So again, that was almost the sort of, our inspiration by Rumi to think of another, one as a human race, which was really powerful. So it was quite emotive that it wasn't only humanitarian aid, but actually in reference to a Turkish famous folkloric poem or literature that is very, very popular around the world as well. So it was almost the stamp that Rumi belongs to Turkey, and therefore this is our stamp to say this is a Turkish way of giving aid, with a Rumi quote. So it was quite interesting. So what would the British way of giving aid look like, for instance? And again, that informs our understanding of that soft power pull, attractiveness. So, and the key word really before I hand over is, when we look at soft power, effectively we're looking at attraction. The attraction to the message, to the story, the attraction to the state. What does that look like, and how are we communicating that? And that is part of the key objectives, key strategic objectives, may I add, when we are actioning and performing public diplomacy. Quite often, when we come to think about how to measure soft power impact, it's very, very difficult. It's one of those things which is not tangible. Quite often it relies on subjective data. Yes, there are rankings which look at tourism, Are more people traveling to this country? Is this country opening up its borders for people to come and visit? Therefore, there's a much more bigger, a favorable image of this country. However, the key points when we are practicing diplomacy is the audience. Who are we speaking to exactly? And also the time is very, very important. The timing of that public diplomacy, when is that taking place in the midst of current world affairs that are taking place? And of course, finally, the location, the medium really, is are you communicating that message in person, online, through the arts, through culture, through sport, through music, and all of those things. And they are sort of the finer details of what is the technique is used. And so therefore, not all countries have a strategic way of looking at things. They are by chance quite often. Some rely purely on the beautiful beaches they have and the beautiful mountains for tourism, and others are quite strategic in terms of, the biggest cultural producer in the world is the United States of America, and irrespective of what is happening in the world. So the fact of the arts, movies industry, Hollywood, for instance, on a daily basis, wherever you go, and even if you look at globalization as a whole, the McDonald's sign, wherever we go, the Coca-Cola images, wherever we go around the world, they remind us of the US, and the belonging of that is actually it's a US product. And that's quite interesting as well. But that is obviously one of the other forms of how we can look at diplomacy. And sorry, and just to finish with, on obviously with COVID-19, quite a lot has been written. And for me personally, I like to, I'm one of those who likes to observe and look at events as they unfold. Very, very easy for us to jump on things very, very quickly and to make judgments and to make conclusions. And I think it's really, really important to look at a very, as much as we read, and of course there are different think tanks and centers who will produce reports early on. It's very important that there are, of course, specific agendas out there, as every nation will have one. It's important that we try to look at things from a nuanced perspective now until we have everything available in front of us before making maybe deeper analytical judgments in terms of how a nation should have maybe responded. But certainly what we can say is that up until now, of course, the numbers we've all been following in terms of the cases, over 2 million, the WHO listing COVID-19 as a global pandemic. The fact that, for instance, there's now almost been a tug of war between the US and China in terms of pointing fingers. And I think that's really, really important in terms of the diplomatic relations. We heard Dominic Raab, actually, when he was asked that what is the relationship going to be like with China post-COVID-19? And effectively was saying, well, we need to rethink that. We need to actually go back to the drawing board and look how that relationship looks like post-COVID-19. Elsewhere, you look at China and its response to the virus and the fact that they've had fewer cases than the whole of Europe. And actually, one could argue that China is actually exercising soft power in this sense by showing that it's technologically advanced and advanced as a nation to cope with any future pandemic in the future, which maybe are questions which we could point to our European governments to say, are we in a position that we're able to contain this in future cases or future pandemics that may arise? So that's really basically the sort of summary of what I'd like us to talk about today. And I think the interrelationship between soft power and public diplomacy, and an extension of that is humanitarian work. And particularly now what we see with the current climate with COVID-19, we've seen a number of cases around the world where different countries have opened its borders. We have seen, of course, the massive economic hit. We've seen, of course, negative numbers on the barrels of oil, which is, we would never have imagined a case like this. And so people are actually being paid to take crude oil off firms because there's just too much, but it's not being used, of course. And so what that does in terms of the relationship with Saudi Arabia and, of course, OPEC and the US and Russia and China and Britain, particularly after, obviously, the Brexit vote, we are in for a very, very interesting next 6 months, 6 to 12 months in terms of what we could possibly see in terms of the global structure, the global relations that we see. And this is, of course, coming on the back of the fact that the past 3 years, Britain has been very, very busy with the Brexit campaign and of course that discussion and the process, which eventually saw some sort of closure. But again, that still needs to be dealt with. And of course, in addition to that, we have conversations around what does Britain look like post-Brexit, its relationship with Europe, how does that look like as well once everything is finalized, but also in particular, the relationship now between the US, between China. And I think, in the midst of all of this, we must not negate the economics, I would say. The economics is very, very important. In terms, of course, before the general election, there was talk of the 5G network taking place here to be introduced in the UK, and whether China would supply that or someone else would. And it's very interesting, and that also has brought up a lot of conversation about having the supplier actually from China and the US exerting pressure on the British government to say, no, don't go for the China offer. And again, similarly, we saw in the case of Turkey and the missiles, which were procured from Russia. And again, the exerted pressure from the US to say, do not take that deal, but actually we have a better deal. So in a nutshell, the diplomacy that we talk of is quite multi-layered. There is the soft element that we have talked about in terms of humanitarian aid. There's also a bit the harder element, which is more about the financial transaction, the economics of that, and of course, military power. But we tend to see now more countries favoring a softer power approach in actually producing itself as a much more favorable country in that sense.
Thank you very much, Omar. It was a very interesting start of our conversation. You really mapped out the field in terms of the connections between soft power, humanitarian diplomacy. At the moment, I don't have questions, so I'm going to maybe have a little some comments to what you've said. We suddenly have quite a lot of questions. That's great. But I'm going to use my soft power as a moderator to make one comment. Obviously, in this talk, we are focusing on soft power, but you also mentioned Bourdieu. Personally, I think soft power is so overused that really has lost its conceptual strength. And for example, personally, I prefer to think about hegemony as conceived by Gramsci, but applied into international sphere, because that really exposes more the power that still exists in soft power. Although soft, it is still effectively power. And I think thinking about it as hegemony exposes more the not so nice side of soft power. And when I was invited to moderate today's talk, I was really interested in the link between humanitarian diplomacy and soft power, because in a way, humanitarian diplomacy hints at idealism, while then on the other side, we have diplomacy, which is obviously about foreign policy, about achieving foreign policy objectives. And I was thinking, can we really conciliate humanitarianism and diplomacy? And thinking about the relation with COVID-19 and what is happening. And if we use actually the case of Turkey, a lot of countries, Turkey does pursue a foreign policy that privileges humanitarianism, but a lot of countries have had, obviously, in terms of COVID-19, a very nationalistic approach, because we are dealing with measures to do with isolation, quarantine, etc. But ultimately, the solution for the COVID-19 crisis will have to be an international or global solidarity, for example, in terms of achieving a vaccine. But stepping back, as I said, and using the case of Turkey, for example, we still have crises that are going on, such as the refugee and migrant crisis. And obviously, Turkey has quite a high population of migrants and refugees. And the responsibility for the care of those migrants and refugees is not purely a national duty. it's international. And I have not really seen actions from the international community to actually look after those refugees. I haven't really seen that much of the international community. Of course, there's some United Nations initiatives. But what do you think? Do you think we are, in a way, at some sort of crossroads? And we don't know, maybe COVID-19 will be sort of transformational in terms of, are we continuing to pursue a nationalistic agenda, or can we move forward global solidarity? And here, in the case of dealing, for example, with the refugee crisis and COVID-19.
Yeah, no, it's I mean, it's a very interesting point, because I think when you mentioned Gramsci and you mentioned hegemony, instantly I thought of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and a Kenyan academic who's written about the decolonization of the mind, and a very powerful and moving book. And Ngugi specifically talks about how the power of language and the hegemony and these power structures, which are really, really important, and how that actually informs part of the global hegemony as we know it, and of course the colonizers and the colonized. And I think one of the most powerful quotes in that book, The Decolonization of the Mind, if I can paraphrase, was along the lines of that the colonization of the land was done, but now the next objective was the colonization of the mind. And that colonization of the mind is, I think what you're referring to here, is that soft power is actually not so soft, but actually can be quite lethal in that sense. So, and I think we see this evidently across, let's say, the Middle East, for instance, where Iraq, with the US war in Iraq, actually a lot of the youth, just after the war, were still attracted to the cultural productions of the US, which was Hollywood, and which was, music and so on and so forth. And that power is incredibly interesting to see the dynamic that, despite the fact that an external body has come in, state, and taken over, invaded, occupied, and then the younger generation have almost forgotten their language or have implemented a new language, whether it be, if we look at, for example, the 1940s, 50s, post-World War II, within that region, Sykes-Picot Agreement, and of course, the French and English system and language adopted in those areas. It was quite interesting to, obviously, you had now an elite who were part of that structure, who again were taught the right way, if we can say, or the sort of civilized way of educating the masses, which was very interesting. And again, the pushback here was, I will not accept that, I will not acknowledge that, and actually I need to understand and be aware that the language that I speak is the power that I have. And again, of course, knowledge is power, and knowledge is language. And I think it's really, really important that we look at history books and who they're written by, for instance. All of that informs a very interesting pedagogy in how we understand and how we learn and unlearn things as well is very, very important. So again, and then bringing that into sort of the wider context and discussion around soft power and states exercising soft power. To what extent are they genuine? To what extent are they part of a political policy objective to strengthen the state at the expense maybe of others? I think COVID-19 has, if anything, shown that when we are entering into a pandemic, the priority is that every country was looking inwards and looking at, how do I protect and save the lives of my citizens. We saw, travel bans being put in place, borders being closed, and then, of course, slowly that impacted on a local scale where people were not allowed to leave their homes, or maybe some countries a complete ban, others a very strongly worded advice to say, please stay. And of course, you have a state-sanctioned one exercise a day here in the UK, for instance. And again, we saw, I believe it was last week, where you saw the US pulling its funding from the WHO. And so I think some states, again, go beyond that and actually say, well, we're no longer part of the international community, for instance. And actually that action was a very powerful statement in no words that was needed, just merely that action itself. It felt that the whole world was basically looking at the US to say, well, you've made your point very clear. You've made your position very clear. Again, what does that do to the soft power of the US, for instance, to other foreign nationals around the world when they look at their response? And this is why I mentioned China in terms of its response to the pandemic, right? And South Korea and Germany, 3 amazing cases where you look at how the response, and of course New Zealand as well, where their response to this pandemic is very, very different to the likes of Italy and Spain and the UK and some Nordic countries as well, where I believe even to this day, they are still, there's no lockdown, there's no quarantine measures put into place. In Sweden, I believe, still some relaxed measures there. So each country will have its own response and reaction to that. But I do think that there lies an opportunity here when we look at internationalism and when we look at how we need to be mindful that during a scenario like this, it is, as a matter of fact, thinking as one nation, right? As opposed to specific different countries. Perhaps there was talk that there could have been a very emergency council put into place, which would have formed a world sort of government or governing body to look at how what policy should be put into place to collectively, as a planet, challenge and actually beat this virus. That was very, very quickly squashed, and again, politics, as it were, got in the way, and every country has its own method in doing things. But then you could argue that maybe China led the way, right, in terms of its response. But then some will say, well, this came out of China. Is some of the sort of feedback that we're getting, and actually maybe knowledge sharing. How could we implement, maybe there are questions for us to ask about, we've been talking here in the UK for quite some time about the funding of the NHS. So there are a number of different factors. It'd be very difficult for us at this stage to point our finger and say, this is it. But certainly the ulterior if we look at the higher stratosphere of how the language and the reporting has been, I completely make this point very confidently that there's been a very distinct either othering or sort of belonging narrative being put into place. And I do think here, in a time like this, even words like, for instance, social distancing, which I find quite problematic, is
physical distancing.
Precisely. I mean, it's more or less physical. Right. And again, even then you can decide to discuss and open the discussion around what is physical, what is not physical. Right. But I mean, the idea of social distancing and how we've normalized that language in our reporting, in our news stories, in our reading, in our reports, in our research is very interesting, because what we're doing here is a form of social connection. Yeah. This is not social distancing. And I think that's important, because it almost is the language we use subconsciously almost forms as a medium to breaking as opposed to bridging. And I think the mechanism for achieving belonging and true sense of belonging in this world is actually bridging, where we are thinking of the other as one of us, and knowing that actually, our neighboring country is going through something like this. We need to be prepared and in solidarity reaching out to them, as opposed to a ban of travel between the two for health measures, granted. But I think the language is very, very important. And we will look back. We will look back at these times and think, what countries adopted the invisible enemy, which many nation state leaders used, right? Whereas actually, perhaps if our approach was a lot bit more forthcoming in terms of our genuine, sincere humanitarian aid and solidarity to one another, I would suspect the level of anxiety would have been far less than where it is at the moment. And I think this is where you need responsible servant leadership in place to actually be sensible, but also pay great attention to detail in terms of the language that we use in describing this pandemic.
I think you're very right. And this time will prove a very rich field of research for many academics, as you say, in terms of discourse analysis.
Sure.
And I just wanted to pick up on something you said before moving on to some of the questions we have here, is actually, that emphasis on the belonging to humanity and the importance of people-to-people relations that many non-state actors actually focus on in terms of kind of developing that long-term relationship, while in terms of state actors and also international organizations, we're still kind of stuck in that as distancing and differentiation of units. And it's interesting, even in the case of COVID-19 and how the WHO is responding to this. For example, Taiwan is not part of the WHO. And we know because of China. But Taiwan actually has been very successful in responding to the COVID-19 crisis. So it's interesting to see the different levels at which this sort of relationship take places and what sort of ideologies and values drive them. So I think more and more in my work, I really look at non-state actors, and I think they are extremely powerful in terms of how the future is going to develop. And that leads me to one question that our participants are asking. Do you think a new world order is being replaced or will take place after COVID-19? It's a big, broad question.
Say that again, sorry?
If you think a new world order will then replace the existing one after COVID-19?
Well, I mean, one can hypothesize, right? One can sort of, I won't be able to give a definitive answer. What I can say is, I mean, certainly I think after the Brexit votes, we saw a new playing field. We saw a new area that Britain was emerging itself in terms of its relationship with Europe. How does that look like now? Again, of course, there's the talk of the transatlantic trade deal between the US and the UK. Again, that is also something to bear in mind and think about. The other thing is also the growing emerging economies who are part now of the G20. So of course, like Turkey, for instance, Brazil, India, China, South Africa. These are emerging economies who are now growing in influence, certainly. And of course, Korea as well, we've seen. So for me, I mean, it's difficult to say whether there'll be a new world order. I think there will always be the understanding that the US will lead the way as the superpower. But again, to what extent, for how long that will last with the current president, I'm not sure. And again, because of the fact that we seem to have failed to predict his foreign policy objectives or goals, they seem to change pretty much every other week. So it's very difficult to say. But what I can say is certainly, if we look at the economics, it's very, very important. Again, Trump boasted quite often that the Dow was always increasing every single day he was in office. And that was something which won him a lot of national votes, a lot of votes, obviously, in the business sector. But now we see America in a position, in its worst economic situation in the modern era. And I think this almost backfires completely on everything that Trump has spoken of. Yet his deflection of certain questions aimed at him in terms of how the US responded by merely pointing the finger and blaming others, and particularly in China, I think is very interesting, because in the initial stages from January, February and onwards, Trump was actually applauding China in terms of its response and saying that this virus will be contained in China. They're doing a phenomenal job. We don't need to worry. And that's completely backfired. And I think this will be almost something which I suspect will be something which will very, very, very quickly, brushed under the carpet, talking about moving forward and coming together and almost being like, well, we all suffered from this. So I don't think he will take a major hit in terms of the political point scoring against them, because you have to also bear in mind his opposition in Joe Biden now recently has been much in the back seat and not taking a very much, very opposing approach. And similarly here in the UK as well, there's been calls by the media for the opposition parties to question response by the government, and of course, what is the exit strategy, and so on and so forth. And of course, there's the conversation around now is not the time for political point scoring, but now is the time for solidarity and coming together. So it's a fine balance. I mean, in short, I don't suspect there will be a new world order. I don't think things will change much. What is changing is blocks of nations in terms of how we do trade. So I think there'll be more alliances. But generally thinking, I do not suspect that there will be a complete makeshift change into the way things are being operated.
Thank you, Omar. So we have a few more questions. So one of them also picking up on the points you were making about Donald Trump. So we have a question that says, very often politicians are focused on the short term, driven by immediate domestic needs and re-election ambitions. And the person says, it strikes me that much of the benefit from using soft power to influence citizens of other nations is in the longer term and strategic. To what degree are you seeing soft power change the way world leaders manage their external image?
Sure, and it's very important that we make note of the short-term and long-term relationship here. I mean, certainly soft power is a tool which needs a lot of care and attention to detail too. I'll give you, for example, a sort of case study. So you have, for example, exchange programs for students to study abroad. And there's an exchange program between the Achieving Scholarship here in the UK. So of course, this is for foreign students to apply for in respective British embassies around the world.
I'm a Achieving Scholar.
There you are. So, okay. So, and where did you apply, Carla, if you don't mind me asking? Where did you apply from?
I'm originally from Portugal.
Okay, so you would have applied from the British Embassy in Portugal, right? And so that scholarship, effectively, that is a strategic, by the way, scholarship. It's part of a three-pronged process for British soft power. And the first is being education, which is the Achieving Scholarship. And so a student abroad will apply for this. And in that student's experience here in the UK, they grow a favorable image and relationship to the UK. Maybe one day, if that student returns to Portugal and becomes a diplomat or works for the diplomatic office, in terms of policy objectives, they tend to become much more favorable between two nations. So this is a very long-term, slow process put into place. So we go to the other two areas within British soft power, and the other is the British Council. So the British Council is an extension of what we understand as the soft power of Britain. And that particularly is about promotion of British culture, language, of course, the English language, and more so the arts, promoting British artists abroad as well. All of that, again, is about relationship building. So when we talk of relationships, it's very difficult to build that trust between two or more parties in a very short-term scenario, which is why soft power is more for longer-term strategic policy objectives, is how can we build a relationship which actually extends for 10, 15, 20, 30 years. And finally, the last sort of instrument employed by the British government, which actually furthers the soft power image, is the BBC World Service, which is pretty much almost in every single country being broadcasted, in almost every single hotel room, wherever you go on the international channels, you'll have BBC World Service, which is an English-speaking channel. So again, media, culture, education. Those are the three which, as I'm sure anyone who is involved in those sectors will know for sure, that none of the work done in those sectors are anything short-term. A lot of it is long-term impact. If we are to look at soft power short-termism in terms of its immediate impact, Then again, the quick windows, I would say, the quick opportunities where there lies a chance for a nation or a non-state actor to enter in to improve on its soft power credentials is COVID-19, which is why we're seeing more and more nations do it. Resource-wise, it costs nothing. Everything is probably subsidized from the nation in terms of the transport, the aid being sent. It's a very quick win, right? The longer, deeper strategic conversation around soft power requires investment of time and resources. Mm-hmm. And so that's why I think when we talk about strategy, it's very few between nations are able to employ that and actually show a case study which that has worked very, very well. Most often now, anything short-term sporting mega events is very short-term. Host a sporting event, done, and you move on. The 2012 Olympics here in London, for instance, what happened afterwards was, again, there were conversation that many communities were pushed out from East London into the outskirts of London. So, you know, you talk of actually bringing a sporting event, and that was the main attraction for a month or so, but then afterwards, the gentrification of that area resulted in a backlash. South Africa, likewise, all those empty stadiums now. Mm-hmm. South Africa does not need those stadiums. Brazil, likewise, the same thing. And that's why we see with Qatar actually a different approach, which was that the stadiums that they are building, they'll take down because they are the smallest nation in the world to host the World Cup. So for them, they don't need 10 stadiums, for instance. So they will take them down and then distribute them as a donation. So that is quite interesting as well, as that fits in within the soft power rhetoric.
And actually, that is a good entry point for a question that was asked here in the chat in terms of changes in the use of soft power. And, you know, you were highlighting here the issue we have that governments invest in those sort of vanity short-term projects that will, you know, make their message very clear to the rest of the world for a short span of time, and then, you know, move on to the next event. And here, you know, we don't really have a long-term sustained effective message that is effectively making a difference to society. Do you see countries or better governments learning from the, you know, countless evaluations that have been done of those sort of projects?
Well, it entirely depends on the government in power. I mean, so you've obviously got the civil service and, of course, the government. And I think civil servants will work for government irrespective of who they are. And again, it's very interesting that, of course, through every term, there will be a specific policy objective. So soft power, it's important to note, there aren't any, you know, transformational changes when it comes to British soft power. Those institutions that I've mentioned to you, the British Council, BBC World Service, and the Shielding Scholarship, have been going on for quite some years, irrespective of who in government is in power, right? Because again, it is promoting British interests abroad, and that is something that every government will support, and actually is actually the title of the FCO, right? Is promoting those British interests abroad. Where I feel maybe it's interesting to see where there are closer soft power relationships to, let's say, the state, the president, the prime minister, that is where all the investment done into the soft power sort of research and resources, I think, requires a sustained effort. So whether it's from term to term, different leaders who come in, some leaders may actually completely refuse a soft power approach and prefer a very much hard power approach, right? There was a conversation and sort of evaluation around the Brexit negotiations. You know, some were saying actually we were maybe being too soft by saying that we wanted no deal off the table, where others were arguing, well, you need to have no deal on the table because that strengthens your negotiation bargaining power. When you enter into a negotiation to say, we're not going to use the no deal option, but we want to keep it on the table, so then it keeps options open. So, and this is really interesting because it is part of the structures of power, actually. When we come to look at bargaining power and how to communicate and mediate and actually have that form of diplomacy between two nations or more, is how we speak to each other and how we have our options open is very, very interesting. So, of course, you have, for instance, the UN Security Council and the power to veto. And so there are effectively, you've got Britain, the US, Russia, France, and China as part of the P5. And the P5 here in this area are able to veto pretty much anything that comes through, any resolution that comes through to them. And so it's very interesting to see that within the world, which is bigger than 5, right, we still have the understanding that actually there are certain specific nation state agendas and relationships which continue to be closely aligned irrespective of who is in government office. So although relationships have maybe suffered a little with, let's say, the current Trump administration with some nation states, generally speaking, there is always a speaking term. The door is never shut completely, right? And we've seen that with North Korea, the amount of times that the door was open and closed and open and closed. And I think that's part of the political drama that we were lucky to see for free. But I think it's important to note that generally speaking, nations always will have an open line. And again, how they maneuver around that, depending on the leader, again, depending on the policy objectives they have, it's very, very difficult to say that there is one way of doing things, because depending on the philosophy of the leadership that are in power.
Thank you, Omar. One final question, because there's 2 minutes
Sure.
to 7 o'clock. So this participant asks, where do you see lobbyism? Is it a form of soft power, or would it be rather a cohesive policy?
Excellent. So this question actually feeds into what we understand as the escalation ladder. And so the escalation ladder effectively is, if we begin at the very base of this escalation ladder, and that is to accuse a country of human rights abuse, for example. So the bare minimum is to call out a country's actions. And then the level above that is a form of lobbyism, and that is non-state actors like Amnesty International, who are lobbying for either Human Rights Watch or the Hague, for instance, to up the ante, up the pressure on the human rights abuses. So certainly that is part of this soft power trajectory here. So the escalation ladder begins at a soft power base, which increases from accusation to lobbying to advocacy, and then you've got sanctions. And then after sanctions, you've got military direct rule. And many academics argue, and including myself, sanctions are actually, although they are a soft power in the sense there is no direct military action, it is an abuse of human rights. And actually it is a form of hard power, because the sanctions being imposed are not on the government per se only, but actually on a state or nationwide sanction. So effectively harming private citizens and individuals who may not agree with the government. So actually the human rights violation that come out of that actually is very, very important, and the economic crippling of the nation. And this is what we saw in Iraq, for instance. Just before the US entered into Iraq, was the economy was completely crippled before the US invaded Iraq because of the sanctions that we saw. And so in answer to the question, lobbyism, yes, it is part of a soft power escalation ladder. However, it is also part of a escalation ladder that includes soft power and hard power, depending on which part of the ladder you are starting or coming down from.
Thank you, Omar. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it at this. We won't be able to answer all the other very interesting questions that our participants had asked. But Omar,
by the way, yes, I'm sorry, I was going to say, I'm very happy
yes.
to, if I can get those via email, I'm very happy to answer them and send the answers back.
Okay, so they're at the moment on the chat, or maybe people, I know you are an active user of Twitter. Maybe yes. They can reach out to you and ask the questions directly. In my case, I'm staff at Goldsmiths. So please get in touch. You just have a look at the website, and I'll be there. So I just want to thank everyone, the Yunus Emre Institute, Dr. Mehmet, Omar, our speaker, and obviously myself, the opportunity of being here moderating this talk and being able to convey the questions to Omar. So thank you very much to all. Stay safe and healthy.
Thank you very much, Carla and Omar. It was a fantastic talk and the moderation. I would like to thank all the participants for their participation. And as you mentioned, you can reach Carla and Omar through ourselves or through their media, social media, or other ways. If you cannot reach them and somehow, please let us know and we can direct your questions to them. Thank you very much, and stay safe and enjoy the rest of your nights. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.